Hello, BookTube. I want to do another entry in the Bookshelf Essentials idea that was created by David Wiley over on his channel that revolves around, it centers on a common idea for book owners, which is what are the books that are essential to your library. Plenty of other things are more peripheral. You may enjoy them. They may stick around for a long time, but they could go and you may get around to replacing them, but you wouldn't miss them. You certainly don't revisit them on a regular basis. So what are the essentials? What are the bookshelf essentials? I've done a couple of these videos. I really enjoy them. And the book that I'm picking today is a bookshelf essential, even though the copy that I'm showing you today is one that I bought in 2023. I routinely give away my bookshelf essentials and then wait to get them back. So the fact that I just bought a hardcover of this in 2023 doesn't really lessen its status as a bookshelf essential. I knew it was essential as soon as I read it in 1984. And this is The Mysterious William Shakespeare by Charlton Ogburn. This is a gigantic thing. This hardcover, you can't really tell in this video, but it's slightly oversized. It's slightly taller than a normal hardcover. This is almost 900 pages as it is. If it had been in a normal dress for a normal sized hardcover, it would be well over 1,200 pages. A big, huge book that made a splash, got all sorts of critical attention when it came out. And I have had copies over the years. I got a copy in 1984. I had copies in the 90s. And I would see them, new and then used. This was also reprinted. And I would get them and then I would give them away. So I have this copy. I'm hoping to hold on to it. And it is definitely a bookshelf essential, even considering that I have an entire literal bookshelf of books on this subject. The subject is announced by the cover. This is The Mysterious William Shakespeare, the myth and the reality. And the myth is under the Drashhout portrait of William Shakespeare from the first folio, and the reality is under a portrait of Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Because that is the purport of this book. This is the most literarily impressive entry in the so-called Shakespearean authorship controversy, which says that William Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, the glovemaker's son from Stratford, did not write the plays that bear his name. That is the Shakespeare authorship controversy in a nutshell, but of course the opponents of that controversy never stick to the nutshell. They move on from there to substitute, well, if he didn't, then who did? And Charlton Ogburn does both of those things in this book. He spends an enormous amount of time at the beginning of the book tearing down the myth. I think he realizes on some storytelling level that he has to do that before he can build up the reality. He has to tear down the myth. So he goes at every aspect of William Shakespeare's typical biography. The typical biography that you would see in a book by A.N. Wilson or Peter Ackroyd or Bill Bryson. The type of standard Shakespeare biography, the soul of an age, the spirit of the era, our first man, our best man, the inventor of the human. In those biographies, and there's an industry of them, there's one at least every year, sometimes more than that. And that's not to talk about the actual industry that exists in England. The Shakespeare tourism industry in England is very, very lucrative. At least it was before the pandemic. I don't know if it's completely bounced back. Those books are often written by authors that I really like. I'm fond of Bill Bryson. I really like Peter Ackroyd. And yet, it's easy to see when you read them what would get the hackles up among the Shakespeare authorship proponents, because those books are so complacent. They're so unquestioning in so much of the stuff that they repeat, without seeming really to understand how much of it comes from an author named Nicholas Rowe and how much of it Rowe seems to have invented. Certainly had no documentary evidence for. It's amazing how much extrapolates from that one little thing, that one little Rowe came out with an edition of Shakespeare's works, and he prefaced it with a biography of Shakespeare. It's amazing how many biographies of Shakespeare are just that little 70-page thing blown up with 1,000 pounds of hot air. It's that myth that Charlton Ogburn goes at in the first part of this book. tearing down the myth. We have no evidence that William Shakespeare, the man from Stratford-on-Avon, ever went to school. We have no evidence that he ever owned a book. We have no evidence that he could read. We have no evidence that he wrote anything. No evidence that he made any money writing things. No evidence that he ever met the Earl of Southampton, his alleged patron. No evidence that any of the writers of his day knew him as a writer. All of the stuff that you think of, Ogburn says in the beginning of this book, that all the stuff you think of as evidence for that is all later. It all comes later. It isn't the kind of actual primary documentary evidence that we would want from and expect from and actually have from every other writer of the period, all of whom knew each other, all of whom talked with each other, corresponded with each other, dedicated things back and forth to each other, all of whom noted when one of their fraternity died. No such notation of Shakespeare at all. Disappears without any public notice whatsoever. The most of what we are led to believe by the Shakespeare proponents was the most celebrated and popular author of his day. All sorts of shortcomings like that. There are all sorts of shortcomings like that. And of course, Charlton Ogburn is not the first person to see them. Plenty of other people saw them. One of the complacencies in typical Shakespeare biographies is to say that those people did not start noticing inconsistencies in the Shakespeare biography until hundreds of years after he was dead, until the 19th century. That isn't true. There are plenty of insinuations and doubts when Shakespeare from Stratford-on-Avon was alive, and plenty in the immediate years after, plenty in the Jacobean era, but they certainly come to light in the 19th century and have never stopped since then. This has been a flourishing sub-industry of the Shakespeare cottage industry ever since then. Some of them have been more famous than others. Some Shakespeare doubters have been more famous than others. Quite a few literary people, quite a few actors. Also Mark Twain, who wrote a book called Is Shakespeare Dead?, in which he rehearses the gigantic lack. Well, he doesn't describe it that way, but later scholars have described that when you go back looking for Shakespeare, not the works of Shakespeare, but Shakespeare, the writer, the person, you don't find him. He's just not there. Even plenty of people who completely believe that Shakespeare wrote the plays of Shakespeare still notice that. Plenty of writers in the 20th century doing those kind of canned Shakespeare biographies would mention offhandedly in their preface, well, I went looking and he's not there. He's not there in the way that Ben Jonson is. He's not there in the way even that Christopher Marlowe is. Pick a smaller, a minor Elizabethan playwright or pamphleteer or whatnot, you can still find all kinds of evidence of a quotidian day-to-day existence that is the existence of a writer. And you can't do that with Shakespeare. You go back and look and it's not there. You have to build and infer. As many Shakespearean authorship proponents have put it in the last 20, 30, 40 years, it's only with Shakespeare biography that you start with a conclusion and then fill it in with your research. That's not how historical or biographical research is supposed to work. You're supposed to start with the research and fill in the picture, build a picture. You're not supposed to start with the conclusion, Shakespeare was a famous author, and then find what you need to fill that in. That's not how it's supposed to work. But if you don't do that, you are left with what one author in the 20th century famously referred to as the world's most prominent missing man. You can go looking for Shakespeare, the author, and you will find almost no traces of him. And even the traces that you find still raise more questions than they answer. Because all that we know about the non-writerly life of William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon jars completely with the idea of the person who wrote the plays that we know. To put it mildly, what we know about Shakespeare the man is discordant with what we know about Shakespeare the writer. And all that we know about Shakespeare the writer is what we know in the plays. And when you read the plays, you are reading the works of an incredibly refined imagination, an incredibly mind-bogglingly extensive vocabulary in a number of different languages, an incredible mind-boggling familiarity with the classics of ancient Greece and Rome. You in the plays, if you knew nothing about the authorship controversy, you would still find it really, really odd that the guy who is built by the biographical details that we know is the guy who wrote these plays. Even if you didn't know there was an authorship controversy, you would come out of that thinking, okay, that's really strange. that's really, really strange. And plenty of people have said that over the centuries. Plenty of writers, plenty of actors have said, well, if you believe that, you have a lot of coincidences to explain. A lot of things are on you to define, because this doesn't make any common sense. Ogburn is responding to that kind of atmosphere in this book by first tearing apart the myth of William Shakespeare. Is it possible to infer that this person knew how to read? Is it possible to infer that this person had access to huge amounts of books in an era that had no libraries? Did this person have lots of books? Well, they feature prominently in Will's, but not in his. Did this person own his plays? If they were the thing that made him wealthy, well, then he must have owned them. Does he leave them in his will? Does he mention them in his will? Does anyone else mention them in connection with him? No, they don't. Nothing like that. No one in Stratford mentions Shakespeare as a writer until there's a Shakespeare industry and a reason for them to do so. In their own day, no, absolutely not. No mentions of it whatsoever. He has illiterate parents. He has illiterate daughters. But in the middle of there, we're supposed to find a genius greater than Jane Austen, greater than Murasaki Shikibu, greater than Tolstoy. Ogburn tears that myth apart, or he tries his best to. How well he succeeds will be up to you. He goes over the known ground. No record of schooling. No evidence that this person ever traveled out of England. No evidence that this person ever knew another language. No evidence that this person ever knew anyone at the Elizabethan court. Never knew anything about court ways, or doctor ways, or lawyer ways, as Mark Twain put it. No evidence of any of that at all. You just have to assume that happened. The typical way being what is sneeringly referred to by the Shakespeare authorship proponents as the magic tavern. The idea being put forward by many Shakespeare biographers, put forward that he just listened avidly at taverns and heard all this stuff and absorbed it all. But Ogburn goes further than that. He goes at the dating of the plays, the alleged authorship of the plays, the works that have Shakespeare's name on them, the mentions in London registers. He goes at the long-standing belief that Shakespeare had a career in the theater. All of it. He just goes at all of it. That is a huge chunk of the beginning of this book. Almost like Ogburn is trying to raise suspense as to where he's going with all this. If that's true, if that's what he was doing in this work, God only knows how much time and effort it took to write this book. But if that's what he's doing, he had to be a little chagrined by the publisher's choice of cover, because they sort of give away where he's going with all of this, because he is not just tearing down the myth. If doubters of the standard Shakespeare orthodoxy would only stop there, they'd be on really firm ground, because whether Shakespeare defenders like it or not, this writer is like no other writer in history. There is nothing connecting the person to the writing. Almost nothing. Certainly not anything like the mountain that we should expect. This guy was, we're told, an active, very prosperous, and very famous and successful writer for 20 years in Elizabethan London. And leaves no trace. That we don't have any parallel of that in any writer anywhere at any time in human history. Just this one guy. If you stop there, if you say, well, okay, it looks like you're reasoning backwards from your starting conclusion that William Shakespeare was a famous author who wrote the plays we know under his name. Should you be doing that? Shouldn't you be able to demonstrate that instead of starting there and working your way backwards? If you stop there, I think you're on really firm ground. But authorship proponents never stop there. They always have a candidate, and their candidates always screw them up. Which is, I think, as much as any reason why these questions are not taken seriously by mainstream academia, because you make yourself look silly when you put forward a solution to a problem that causes more problems than it solves. And unfortunately, Charlton Ogburn does that in this book, because his candidate is Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, who died years before a lot of Shakespeare's plays appeared. And who left literary remains, some scanty literary remains that, needless to say, to put it mildly, don't display Shakespeare's level of genius. They don't do it. Experts have come forward since this book came out, swarming over the idea that someone could write Shakespearean Elizabethan plays by remote control, when actually this was incredibly collaborative and incredibly hands-on. And linguistic analysis of the plays has since almost conclusively demonstrated that a lot of that collaboration was line by line, speech by speech, scene by scene, not anything that could be done with a dead man, not anything that could be done on a dead man's manuscripts. And, of course, the theory that Edward de Vere was the author of all the plays of Shakespeare raises immediately the same kinds of questions. Well, where's your proof? Where's your proof of that? Where are his manuscripts? We don't have his will. There's no mention by any contemporary that he had stacks of manuscripts lying around. There are plenty of people who lived in houses with him. No mention from them. No hint of any kind. He was put forward earlier than Charlton Ogburn by a guy who analyzed aspects of Shakespeare's plays and devised a kind of suspect portrait of what the man would be like who wrote those plays, and just innocently stumbled on Edward de Vere. I don't know that I believe that story, but once Ogburn is done tearing apart the myth of William Shakespeare, he then raises up the reality, which is that in his conception, Edward de Vere wrote these plays. Couldn't make his name public because he was a nobleman, and it was considered a little mark of shame to write for the public, for the grubby pit dwellers in Elizabethan England, so he couldn't put his name on it himself. But according to Ogburn, not only did he write these plays, but everybody at the time knew that the name Shakespeare was a pseudonym, a frontman of some kind. That it wasn't that it isn't. We're not saying that the glove merchant's son, the grain hoarder from Stratford-on-Avon, who couldn't sign his own name consistently from one page to the next of the same document, wrote King Lear. We're saying that guy didn't write King Lear, and everybody knows it, and everybody knew it at the time. Again, you run into problems, because if everybody knew it, well, you'd think somebody would say it. We have a lot of documentation from the Elizabethan era, and although a lot of people in the Elizabethan era made pretty broad hints that Shakespeare is not the author of the plays, no one ever said anything directly. And that means there's an absence of proof here. There's an absence of proof, just like there is with William Shakespeare himself. Ogburn takes the familiar route, since this book has become a lot more familiar, of plotting out a lot of the similarities in Oxford's life, a lot of the things in the details of Oxford's life that show up in Shakespeare's work, when that ought not to be true. Shakespeare dedicates his 2 long poems to a nobleman, but it's not Oxford. Did they know each other? And if they didn't know each other, why are all these parallels here? Why are there so many parallels between the life and experiences of Edward de Vere and the plays of the man called William Shakespeare? Why would that be? If you know anything about this subject, you probably know some of the famous ones. For instance, in Hamlet, in Shakespeare, there's a scene where a character is accosted by pirates and stripped of his clothing and sent on his way. And that actually happened to Edward de Vere. It didn't happen to anybody else in the entire era, then went home to London. But it happened to him. Also, we have a lot of de Vere's books, and a lot of the passages in those books that he highlighted and noted turn up in Shakespeare. There's an almost one-to-one comparison between the two. It seems like a weird coincidence, doesn't it? That these two unrelated guys would both be struck by the exact same passages in the exact same literary works, most of which Shakespeare, the guy from Stratford-on-Avon, would not have had ready access to, and all of which were included in the home of Edward de Vere's father-in-law. These coincidences pile up. They're too much for Ogburn. He sees these coincidences and says, oh, come on. There's no way. There has to be another explanation, and the explanation is fairly obvious, which is that somehow this guy wrote those plays. You hit a fatal problem. The dates don't line up, which has led people who forward this theory are called Oxfordians. And it's led them to say a number of different things, from the ridiculous, like the fact that Oxford didn't die when we think he did, and went on living under disguise somehow. They say the same thing about Christopher Marlowe. Or that the dating of the plays is wrong. They're on a lot stronger ground there. A lot stronger ground, I think, than a lot of them realize. That as to the vagaries of dating here. I don't know that the dating would be by 10 years. I don't think it would be off by that much. And there's also the fact that you can't just mail these things in a padded envelope with your return address on it to, a theater company on the banks of the Thames. You can't just do that. The playwright was working with the actors. He was working with everyone to make the play. You can't be done by remote control. And there's no evidence that Oxford did that at all. So, so yes, his plays, William Shakespeare's plays, show all kinds of things that Oxford would have known, of familiarity with the law, a familiarity with royal pastimes like falconry, a familiarity with Italy. All sorts of things that Oxford would have known. He did spend time in Italy. He did know the mightiest of the mighty in his realm. And that William Shakespeare, even if he were a member of an acting company, would not know. Much less write with such easy familiarity. But I'm not talking even about that. Ogburn goes on at great length about that, and so do most Oxfordians. I'm talking about the way of the plays. The way of them is very confidently assured of nobility. The voice in the play is not what you would get from a glovemaker's son. And that is not snobbery. That is objective reality. We know that because Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson were both they were both successful playwrights who were the sons of men in the exact same type of employment and social register as the father of the man of William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon. And Marlowe's lines are intentionally purple. Marlowe's mighty line comes from that. It's him intentionally writing a kind of science fiction space opera. And Ben Jonson's plays, they don't read like Shakespeare at all. They are brilliant, but they are brilliant from the ground up, not from the palace down. I think myself that reading Shakespeare's plays is the first way to think there's something wrong with this biography. You're telling me this guy went home and speculated in grain? I don't believe it. I don't believe it at all, unless that is the story. Unless that is the story that you're telling. That is never the story that the Stratfordians are telling. That's just a bide effect, a little side detail. If that happened, that would have to be the main story. That would have to be the poet Rimbaud leaving poetry and becoming literally another person who never touches poetry again. But that's not the story that the Stratfordians are telling. They're telling something in which, oh yeah, of course he did. Yeah, he wrote the greatest plays in the history of humankind, and then he went home and hoarded grain. But whether or not you're convinced will be up to Ogburn. And I want to stress two things about this book. One is that if you're not convinced by him, at least that the standard pieties of those biographies by Ann Wilson or Bill Bryson or Peter Ackroyd are wrong, that there's something definitely wrong at the heart of them, that their complacency is either hiding or at least repeating a serious flaw. You'll either come out of this book convinced of that or you won't. If you're not convinced of that at the end of this book, then don't bother with any other Shakespeare authorship books, because if Ogburn can't convince you in this book, you won't ever be convinced. But the other thing that I want to mention about this book, and the thing that I think really makes it a bookshelf essential of mine, is how enjoyable this is. I know it doesn't seem it. It seems like it'd just be a crackpot grinding on about a crackpot theory for 1,000 pages, but Ogburn is a wonderful, wonderful writer. That's what struck. I reread this year when I found this copy, and that's what struck me more than anything else. That's what struck me. I realized that again for rereading this copy, I realized that is what enchanted me about the last 2 times that I read it, is how enjoyable it is to read him on the page. That shouldn't surprise me, because he's written 2 other books that I really like. That are not. I know you're going to think they're more Shakespeare authorship crankery, but they're not. He wrote a book called The Adventure of Birds, and he wrote a book called The Winter Beach. The first is about the wonder of birds in the natural world, seeing them, learning about them, their biology, their natural history. And the other is about the beach in winter, the season when people don't go to the beach. And the Adventure of Birds is terrific, and The Winter Beach is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. A true keeper of the classical natural history world, of natural history writing. Not at all in the same register or anywhere near the same subject matter as this book, but they're united by that wonderful writing. This I mean, wonderful writing is wonderful writing. I don't actually have a copy of The Adventure of Birds, but I have to admit, of course, probably the thing that makes this essential in my library is that it's that wonderful writing, yes, but it's attaching itself to a subject that I love reading about. I just love reading about this subject. There are plenty of books on the subject. Plenty of them are not convincing. Plenty of them aren't even thought-provoking. A lot of the suppositions and the reaches that Oxfordians or Marlovians or Baconians or whoever your candidate is, they're named by their candidates. They shouldn't have candidates. There shouldn't be any candidates. It should just be, this story doesn't make sense. I don't know what does make sense. I wasn't there. Most of the records we would need to know are gone. But the story you're telling me doesn't make sense. That this guy wrote King Lear doesn't make sense. That didn't make sense. That's not just crackpots. That hasn't made sense to a whole bunch of authors who know the correspondence between the personal life and the written word better than normal people do. What I'm trying to say is that Mark Twain wasn't a crank. No matter what you think of Charlton Ogburn, Mark Twain wasn't a crank. Although I don't think you're going to get the impression that Ogburn was a crank if you read this book. Maybe he became one later in life. But on the page here, no. And this is tremendously fun to read about. It's why I have, a dozen books on this subject, because whether or not you come up with a candidate, and whether or not your candidate makes any sense. Marlowe dies too young. Bacon was a figure in the public eye from when he was 16. No chance that he was secretly writing Romeo and Juliet. De Vere dies too early. There are even theories that someone like Queen Elizabeth took time out of her schedule to write the plays of Shakespeare. There are all sorts of theories. None of them make a whole lot of sense. But they are all revolving around a central thing that I love, which is when someone comes upon a settled piety of history or biography and says, how do you know that? I have now read this in 20 books. This same thing. He poached a deer. Etc. He went to London and held horses at the theater door. Worked as an apprentice. Sent home money to keep his family, etc., etc. I've read that in 20 books. How do you know any of that is true? Where are you getting any of that? I love it when books do that, whether it's Shakespeare or The Princess in the Tower or anything. I love it when books do that. I love it when authors do that, and the more passionate, the more informed they are. And this is an enormously informed book. Enormously informed. The more passionate and the more informed they are, the better I like it. Even if they're upsetting a piety that I'm fond of. I mean, I of course am a raven-haired 28-year-old, but a long, long time ago, my great-great-grandfather was fond of the idea, for instance, of the heroic last stand of George Armstrong Custer and his men. Flowing golden locks in the harsh plain sunlight. The last stand, a heroic last stand, etc., etc. A succession of books have ripped that apart. It hurt a little to see that go, but a succession of books have ripped that illusion apart. Even when the piety is something I like, that I'm fond of, I'm still willing to see it challenged, happy to see it so. This is about as magnificent a challenge to that piety as you can find. There are other, also very, very good Shakespearean authorship books. Diana Price wrote one about her forensic approach to what a 20th century writer referred to as the missing man. She also went looking in the records and said, where is he? I should be able to find a lot more than what I'm finding. And I should also be able to find at least one example of the kind of thing that I'm looking for. The kind that links the writer with the man. And I'm finding almost nothing. There's almost nothing here. Considering the outsized nature of the reputation, why isn't there 10 times more? Why am I having a hard time finding these things? She was not the first person to go and find that missing man. Imagine how embarrassing it is if you're a British man of letters in the 20th century. You are conscripted to write a quick coffee table illustrated biography of William Shakespeare, and you think, well, I can do that. I mean, I can... A.L. Rouse has a book. I can just crib from that. I don't need to go any further than that. But there's no Wikipedia at the time. But, there's A.L. Rouse. There's 10 other books like his. I could do that, but I'm kind of curious. I'm fond of word games. I'm fond of etymologies. How do any of these people know this? And imagine if you're that author, you've got, the 350 pounds in your hand. Maybe it's already spent. You dig around in those records and realize, okay, all right, I know what my publisher wants. They want me to repeat the story about the poaching deer. They want me to repeat the story about holding horses and sending back money to the family in Stratford. But I'm not finding any of that. I'm finding a rather obvious cobbling together of a story much later on. So what do? Of course, you write the book that you had the £350 for. You don't write an incendiary new book, no matter how many writers purvey writers in their novels as being heroic trailblazers. None of them are. But nevertheless, that writer was no fool. There are writers to the left and right of that writer who also were no fools, who looked back at that and saw a conspicuous lack of what they were looking for. So Charlton Ogburn is not the first person to do something like this. I think the thing that makes this so essential in my library is the wonderful combination of those two elements. How wonderfully and just surroundingly brilliant this is. It surrounds you, and he's always there on the page. He's always present with a wry retort or an anecdote of some kind. It's not cheap or easy writing at all. It's really, really steep. And also the subject matter. You're going to run into serious problems. If you think that Edward de Vere wrote the plays of William Shakespeare, you're going to run into serious problems. Yes, there are enormous parallels between Oxford life and the events of Shakespeare's plays. Enormous, unignorable parallels. I named one about pirates, but oh my God, there are hundreds of them. Far too many for you to just cavalierly say, he could have heard this in a tavern, or it was common knowledge in London. If it was common knowledge in London, find someone else who was saying it. It was a bad idea in Elizabethan London for you to retail the biographical details of a nobleman. The Earl of Oxford had men. He had men in the Oxford livery. It would only take one of those to beat your brains out in a moonless London night. And you knew that as well as anybody. The subject, you're going to run into trouble despite those parallels, despite the fact that Oxford had access to information about Italy, to books, to manuscripts, that William Shakespeare of an acting company would not have had access to. He wouldn't have even known that he didn't have access to them. He wouldn't have known they existed. Those parallels are real, and they are not something you can just lightly write off. They don't exist anywhere else in the Elizabethan world. They're not a staple feature of the landscape. If you just write them off, then you are doing what Ogburn criticizes critics for doing, which is starting with your conclusion and working backwards. But even so, Oxford had no literary ability. There is no more first-hand evidence that he wrote the plays than there is that Shakespeare didn't. And he dies too early. He dies before a lot of the plays were published, which forces you to violate Occam's razor. It forces you to say either he didn't die then, or the plays weren't written then. And then you're off to the races with more and more exfoliating conspiracy theories. Can get a little bit tricky, to say the least, but it's fun to see a really smart, really good author go at it. And this one does. So I could have picked a number of books from my Shakespeare shelf. I have a whole shelf of books about Shakespeare, in addition to another shelf of books, studies of his work and collections of his work. I could have picked another one, but this one really gets it for me. This one is the most satisfying. So there you go. That is a bookshelf essential for you with a lot of digression. That is a bookshelf essential, my last of the year. And if I remember correctly, I will try to leave a link to David Wiley's original one of these so that you get the idea of what he's talking about. But this was essential for me. I could get rid of all the other Shakespeare stuff and still keep this. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.